Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics Football. It's Fran here, and I'll be looking at some of the drafts that were sent to me through Twitter recently, where I was asking for people who would provide me some kind of wildcard drafts and look at kind of ideas and templates that we can discuss as a community about what would be the preferred wildcard draft. Now, I think what's interesting is a lot of people, as per my suggestion as well in the previous wildcard templates video, have tried to incorporate Salah, Lukaku, and Ronaldo, and that will be a recurrent theme in the draft. I think what happens there is that you do become a bit rigid, but with two transfers and effectively three free transfers all the way into game week 7 where Chelsea hit their stride, I think you can still kind of maneuver your team around and try to maximize points by getting these three premiums at a kind of fixture period where I'd say they have quite nice games, with maybe exception to Lukaku. I think bar the Aston Villa game, who you might want to target, to be honest, quite severely because Martinez is gone. He doesn't have the loveliest games when we compare and contrast to Salah and Ronaldo. But I think the issue, of course, with Ronaldo is that he has tough games. And with Salah, I think we see him as a set and forget fixture for most of FPL for the season. But let's actually start with Jack Tatum's draft. So I think Jack Tatum once again follows that kind of structure where you have these kind of three players, these three core players, and that puts a lot of reliance on your team on these three midfielders, when you play this 3-4-3 structure, because by having Salah, Ronaldo, and Lukaku, you have very little budget, and that also forces you into two 4.0 defenders, which I don't think is terrible because the options we have this year at 4.0 in terms of defense are very solid. And I think there are still nice enough fixtures between Livramento and Williams for them to, come in clutch and be useful there. Mendy obviously is not going to provide a lot in that kind of midfield role, but I can understand why you have 0.1 in the bank. It's all about kind of getting back into Reece James as an example. And I think I completely respect that. And as I said, with this structure, it does look very rigid, but you have three free transfers heading into game week 7. And it could even be the case where you drop Ronaldo and shore up your midfield based on that. Because I think a lot of people will think, what if Gray stops hauling? And that will be a big question for a lot of people, right? But ultimately, I think you can still do a double transfer of Ronaldo eventually. Whether Ronaldo should be dropped is a separate question, but I think we can address it later on once we actually have a bit more of the eye test. I think now is a nice game to have Ronaldo. To be honest, it's Newcastle. It's a fantastic game for both, all three of the premiums. So I do like this draft, and I think it's a bit of a risky draft and it's inflexible, but I think it can be easily, maneuvered so that it can be flexible by game week 7, and that's all we really need it to be at this point. And I think I do like this draft. I think the only question mark might be on, what if Rafinha becomes an interesting option? How do we move into him a little bit sooner? And maybe we actually can't do that, and it's fine because you sacrifice that by having the three premiums, and that's really totally up to you, to be honest. But I do like this draft. The next draft is actually going to be by a user called IcyYuupe. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce that. I hope I pronounced it correctly. This is still, I think, a rather interesting draft because instead of incorporating Ronaldo, we have Lukaku. And I can completely understand the sentiment to not go into Ronaldo right now. I think arguably, with exception to the first three fixtures, when you hit that kind of game week 7 stride, you're not really interested in Man United players. And I think this has been reflected by this draft, which is very, very Man United shy. The only question mark I would say about this draft is, is the bench a little bit too weak? Because we are relying on Duffy to play in this team. And I do think that there is a little bit of a weakness in terms of that, right? I also think that the preference to have Son in the team also kind of trims down on the strength of the midfield and the bench, as I mentioned. So I think that Dean, to be honest, at 5.4 has dropped a lot of value over the course of the season. So I think that's why I'm not really a big fan of having Dean if you're wildcarding, because to be honest, right now, when you watch Everton play, Dean plays very defensively. He's not exactly given the free roaming role, the attacking role in terms of open play for him to get, what we would say 7 to 8 assists over the course of the year. I do note that he's taking some set pieces, which is huge for him as a player. But I feel like that kind of drop off in terms of how active he is in open play means that he's not worth it at 5.4. I just feel like there are better options in terms of making your team more well-rounded, right? If we have, some Wolves players as an example, and also potentially already some Chelsea players, because as we mentioned in some of our cheat sheet videos, there are very, very good and capable defenders at the 5.0 to 5.5 range. So I think that's just personally how I feel about that right now. Trincao, I think, is interesting. I don't think he's really, to be honest, like one of the best 5.9 options in the game. As I mentioned many times, I think a lot of people in the community have asked me what I think about the 6.0 and below defenders, and I think, to be honest, I'm not very interested in them. I just think Trincao, who was someone I watched, all year round in Barcelona, could get 1 or 2 goal involvements in around 8 games. And that's too poor a tally because I think he's a technical player, but clearly not that composed at times. And when you're also playing versus worse teams, what you have to notice as well is that you are playing versus lower blocks. And that just means, 1 or 2 additional men who are going to be defending you when you're in transition. And those things will perhaps, I think, give Trincao a bit more issues. Whereas someone like Traore can simply blow by some players through his sheer athletic skill, I think. But ultimately, they're both not too interesting for me. I feel like Son just makes this draft just a bit too rigid. And ultimately, Son almost hits like a roadblock at game week 5 where you think, oh, I should really start moving away from these players. And I feel like this team has a little bit of a harder time going into Chelsea players than some other teams. And I feel like there's probably more potential and more value in the cheaper midfielders simply more than Son right now. And that's exactly why I wildcarded myself. I prefer options like Torres, Jota, and Greenwood at this point in time. I can understand the Leeds preference there. I have no real issues with going for Leeds. They have a tough game week 4, but that's really about it. Other than that, you're talking about wonderful fixtures from that point on. And these 2 players will continue to be glued because I imagine Dan James will probably be playing a rotation role with Jack Harrison. I'm not exactly sure how that's going to pan out. We'll have to wait and see how that affects maybe Rafinha's role. But I think Bamford is a very solid option and someone who's been neglected, to be honest, for now. The next option and the next draft is going to be from John B757. So I like this draft as well because it's one of the first few drafts where we incorporate Man City players, and I think it's a very reasonable incorporation of these players. As I mentioned in the cheat sheet video, if you're going to drop someone like Trent, Diaz has to be that kind of option who's in your team, because I think that's the only way you can justify dropping Trent, for having someone who is set and forget in a fantastic defensive team who could get 1 or 2 goal, a solid amount of goal involvements as well. What we saw last year was that Man City provided a baseline to get almost like 20 clean sheets, right? And clearly, Man City defenders, if they're set and forget, which Diaz is, are fantastic. Cancelo is also at this point, I think, in this season where I think he still has Guardiola's kind of faith, and I think he almost has Guardiola's faith to play left back or right back at a starting as a starter, and can have the baseline to have maybe like 60 minutes of gameplay, which means a locked-in clean sheet, maybe like three out of 4 weeks, right? And I feel like that's fantastic. And that's all we really need from Cancelo. Maybe not 3 out of 4 weeks, obviously. That was me being a bit ambitious. But I'd say, half the time. And he also clearly has the most, I think, potential to have goal involvements in the system. He clearly is the most advanced in terms of how fullback kind of progress deep into, the opponent's box. So I feel like Cancelo is still a very super interesting option. I like the fact that you've taken that risk there. And that, of course, does allow you to go for Ronaldo and Lukaku. The only issue I'd say is that I feel like you shouldn't be sleeping on Liverpool, and that's probably the only issue with this draft, right? Not having Trent is I think, arguably fine if you can replace him with the right amount of kind of Man City and Chelsea players, and I imagine most of these Man City players will be moving into Chelsea players very shortly. But I still feel like Salah or Jota at least is a huge miss, because right now you have the opportunity to kind of play with those 2 players, and I feel like Son, as I mentioned, once again, is a very inflexible piece right now, who I think is slightly overvalued. I actually started the season with Son. I thought Tottenham would attack a little bit better, but I feel like I have been a bit dismayed with them. Perhaps I'll actually be proven wrong, or at least, Son will have a very nice kind of Crystal Palace fixture. But that point onwards, I feel like you're looking at options like, Jota being slightly more interesting, at least in the medium term compared to Son. And it's not like Son has fantastic fixtures himself, really. Post game week 4. So that's sort of how I feel about that. But ultimately, I feel like I think I respect the amount of effort that's put into risking for Man City players, and I feel like you can't really go wrong with that. The only issue is, let's say, if Cancelo doesn't play, or if you run into an issue where Cancelo only plays 45 minutes, because we've seen Pep is the type of manager who's okay with substituting his defensive players at 45 minutes. How do we deal with that? I think you probably also want to get out of Omobamidele if possible. But I feel like ultimately this is a very strong draft, and the only issue might be lack of Liverpool players, and perhaps there could be a bit of thought, maybe even putting into getting someone like Jota into the team so that we can actually have a bit more of that flexibility as well. But that's really it, to be honest. The next draft that we're actually going to look at is going to be Pierre's draft. So Pierre actually debuted a draft with Reece James, and I feel like a mention I've made to some people is that I feel like if you're wild carding, you shouldn't really have Reece James in your draft. I feel like you can probably get another Chelsea player in the meantime, right? Who could actually get you a haul versus Aston Villa first, because it doesn't really make sense to do anyways. This is the first draft that I think has a non 4.5 keeper, which I respect. De Gea has wonderful fixtures post game week 15, but I still feel like right now he's a bit of a weak option for the next few fixtures. Perhaps he becomes a very interesting one versus Newcastle, which I think could be maybe quite a high, shot heavy game for De Gea. But after that, we're talking about, I would say, slightly poorer fixtures for De Gea, a lot of tough matchups heading your way. And I feel like some people have also considered Jose Sa as well at 5.0 being an interesting option. Ultimately, I would probably say there's probably room later in the season to actually consider De Gea as a 5.0 keeper when we head into game week 15. But right now, I feel like it's not the time to do so. And given the fact that he's not close to a price rise or anything like that, I just feel like there's no reason to really go into him. I do like the midfield here. We have for the first incorporation of like Jota and Salah into a draft. And once again, it seems like you've shown a preference to not go into Ronaldo, and that's totally fine. I think I'm not going to say that Ronaldo hype is too much, but I feel like it's not 100% necessary to have Ronaldo in your team. If you want to have Lukaku in your team and you feel like Ronaldo's not going to exist in your team past game week 7, it's totally fine to go with Lukaku instead, in my opinion. And I feel like this draft is probably the most complete in terms of how strong the bench is, to be honest. And that's why I can understand why you have Reece James as per now. But I feel like, to be honest, the only two issues would be Reece James and De Gea. Could we actually maybe have a bit more of a stronger team for now, so we can attack the fixtures in the short term, and then maybe we have a plan later on. For example, because we have 3 free transfers to game week 7, you can definitely get Reece James no matter what. You might only need to touch one between Torres and Jota because Rafinha becomes an option as well. I think the bench here is also perhaps arguably a bit too deep once again. The kind of money that we could trim off from let's say taking Jota out of our or Gray out of our team rather would be quite interesting for me, because I feel like you're probably only going to have Gray as a bench option in the recent games. Maybe you bench Benrahma in game week 5 when he's against United, but I feel like you're probably better off having a slightly weaker bench so that you can actually strengthen your team as we head into those Chelsea fixtures. And that's pretty much how I feel about that. Because, for example, I think as well with Benrahma, if you're wildcarding into him, given the fact that West Ham's fixtures, in my opinion, are actually getting slightly tough, and he could be somewhat more rotation prone in the future, having the option to go into Rafinha is great because you have the money in the bank. But then I would be a bit off put by that if I have Gray in my team as well. I feel like this is one of those drafts where you don't need to spend that much money in terms of the bench. You just look towards kind of upgrading your defense as time comes, because clearly, a lot of that money comes from not having Trent in your team, and that's totally fine. You can not have Trent in your team. I understand that, but I would rather you have a stronger kind of starting 11 if you're going to drop Trent than having a stronger bench, basically, is how I would suggest going forwards. But otherwise, it's a very, very nice draft. We're going to look at Hamza's draft next, or last rather, and I think Hamza's draft is probably a draft that I would say is a mix of, I think, attacking the fixtures and also perhaps maybe going too early into Chelsea players. Because the way I feel about this draft is that I like Kane for Crystal Palace, but I also think that Ronaldo, especially with him kind of quarantining and coming back and probably being fit to train by Wednesday, we're saying that Ronaldo probably has 4 days to train. And ultimately he's going to debut, I think, as a starter versus Newcastle. So I'm not exactly sure why we'd have to move away from that. I don't necessarily know what the budget is for this team as per now. I like Christensen for now, but I feel like Mount, once again, is one of those options who you don't need to have, because I don't think Mount is like an explosive option, right? I think he might be reasonable when you hit game week 7 because Chelsea have such lovely fixtures, and ultimately having 3 Chelsea players is probably a must, I would say, arguably. And during that period, it's interesting to have Mount. But I think given the fact that Jota has such nice fixtures, and even Torres arguably has nice fixtures too, there isn't a necessary need to get Mount right now if you're wildcarding, because, as I say, your 3 free transfers as you head into game week 7. You probably want to maximize on people with better fixtures in that meantime. With Kane, I feel like, I mean, the argument's just always going to be against looking at Lukaku, and I feel like right now, when you've been watching Kane, he's played as a substitute one game and then 90 minutes versus Watford, and I feel like the amount of chances created for Kane just simply isn't enough to warrant saying that, he's going to have plenty of chances. Now, of course, Ronaldo, we haven't seen him play with United yet, but we've seen how many shots that some players have gotten off already in recent games, and we've seen, of course, the offensive potential that United have just in terms of pure goal scoring last year. So I feel like that is a good enough basis to say Ronaldo's probably a slightly more interesting option than Kane right now. That's my personal opinion. I feel like the Emerson transfer doesn't change too much. He might have slightly better delivery into the box than Tanganga, but that is realistically about it. I think Spurs look most threatening, to be honest, on set pieces because they have, Son on the delivery, and their open play chances just simply haven't been good enough. I feel like that midfield is just a bit too static, with the exception to Højbjerg, who I really like as a creative player. But most of the time, I would say this draft looks exceptionally solid. I feel like I can understand people taking the punt on Traore, and that's fine. Maybe I'm not too risk-seeking in that sense. I don't really want to have Traore on my team, but I can completely understand having one of those pieces in your team because the rest of your team looks very solid. Once again, the question mark would be what to do if, let's say, you want to get into Rafinha. I imagine that there might be budget to go into that, or maybe Ronaldo. And I feel like, you can probably go Mount a little bit later if you want to go for Mount. And that's pretty much all I would say about this draft. I think you can also get Williams, who seems to be picked preferentially ahead of Omobamidele. So that's probably just the only kind of slight adjustment I would make. Otherwise, I think this is a very solid draft, and I'd be very happy with this draft too. But that's it for the video now, guys. I think the wildcard drafts are very, very similar right now. I feel like there's going to be an argument between people where they're split between getting 3 premiums or 2 premiums. And then also I think there's the argument about dropping Trent and not dropping Trent. And I feel like, with fantasy, what we found out over time is that there's no right option, clearly. I think over time, we'll especially with people who go for 3 premiums, I don't expect you to be sitting with 3 premiums over the course of the season. It might be the case that you think that targeting those 3 premiums for now, and if you have, let's say, plans to get out of them, means that they're worth the value that they give you, let's say, with game weeks 4, 5, and 6 going ahead. So I feel like ultimately we can look at these drafts and probably criticize them a bit too much, but I think most people have the right idea in terms of drafts. I think most people are capitalizing on the right fixtures. The only thing I'd say right now is if you're just looking at the eye test, I think the only common trap that I would say some people are falling into is I do think Spurs aren't a great attacking side right now. I think when you compare to some of the other premiums and the other talismanic players, they're just not really worth their value right now. Even Son, who to be honest is someone I had in my team originally, I'm personally looking to move out of him. But that's all I would say right now in terms of the drafts. Thank you guys so much for watching the video as well. Let me know how you guys feel about these drafts, but I'll see you guys soon. And, with hopefully, my exams finishing up soon, I'll be able to kind of actually post my wildcard team or template as we get some news and as we kind of also anticipate some of the press conferences coming in soon for the managers. Thank you very much.